Hey, want to talk about research questions? In a perfect world, research starts with a question. Now, if we're really honest, your research project will probably begin with an assignment to do research, but either way, the quality of your research project will depend a lot on the quality of your research question. Think of it this way. If you meet someone new, you'll have one kind of conversation if you ask them where they're from and what they do for a living, but you'll have an entirely different kind of conversation if you ask them who would win in a fight between a bear holding a shark or a squid holding a tiger. The kinds of questions you ask will in fact determine the kinds of conversations that you'll end up having. In a very similar way, the kinds of research questions that you ask will have a huge effect on the research paper that you end up writing. Because of that, it's worth thinking carefully about the kinds of questions you're asking throughout the length of the research process. That way, you can be sure that the questions you're asking are leading you in a productive direction. So today we'll be talking about 4 kinds of research questions and the kinds of research papers that they would lead you to write. Our goal is to help you to develop more meaningful research questions so that then you can write more powerful research papers. Of course, if that's the sort of thing that doesn't sound excruciatingly dull, go ahead and subscribe so that you'll always know when more not excruciatingly dull videos come out. Alright, on with the show. Perhaps the most basic kind of questions you can ask are fact-oriented questions. These are your basic who's, what's, whens, and wheres, the kinds of questions that are meant to establish a simple fact. Simple facts like these aren't really up for debate because people can see them and just point them out. Simple questions of fact might look something like this. What's the freezing temperature of water at sea level in Kelvin? The answer is a fact. How many legs do capybaras have? Again, the answer is a straightforward fact. Was the Declaration of Independence written in Arizona? Once more, your answer would be a one-word fact. Now, the research process for answering a fact-oriented question isn't very involved. Most likely, you'll just Google something, find the answer, and then you'll have it. Because of that, it's pretty hard to write a paper about a question of fact. In a lot of cases, the answer to that research question will be a word or maybe a short sentence, and so you can probably see that you're not going to be able to write a 4 or even a 10-page paper around a question of fact, unless, of course, you're using heavy doses of fluff. Of course, that's not to say that fact-oriented questions are inherently bad. They have their value, and you need to know simple facts in order to establish an argument. But the point here is that fact-oriented questions have relatively simple answers, and so if you stop your research process at that level, you're going to have a hard time developing a strong academic argument. Moving up a level of complexity, relational questions are invested in figuring out how different facts fit together, and they might look something like this. How is the Kelvin temperature scale related to the Fahrenheit scale? What kind of animal is a capybara? How did the Declaration of Independence make the state of Arizona possible? With research questions like these, your research and writing processes are going to be somewhat more complex than they would be with simple fact-oriented questions. You're not going to be able to just identify an individual fact and say there's your answer. Instead, you're going to have to understand how those different facts relate to each other. You could think of relational questions as groupings of factual questions. If, for example, you're going to explain what kind of an animal a capybara is, you'll have to start by knowing what a capybara is in the first place. You'll also have to understand how biologists classify animals and what characteristics capybaras have in common with other animals. In order to answer a relations-oriented question, you're also going to have to answer several facts-oriented questions along the way. But even then, you're not really going to have the kind of material for a compelling rhetorical argument. As we've said before, rhetoric only works when things are up for debate, and the answers to relational questions just aren't really up for debate. In fact, questions from these first 2 categories probably set you up better to write something like a 4th grade research report. I remember having to write papers then that involved learning the 4 different types of volcanoes, or listing traditional foods from a certain part of the world. You see, to do well on those kinds of papers, you don't have to make an argument or change anyone's mind, you just have to get the facts right. So while fact and relation-oriented questions can be a good place to start, it's important to recognize that they aren't going to get you very far when it comes to writing a compelling academic argument. The fact is, the answers to those questions are just too simple. Questions that are aimed at evaluation begin to get you and your readers thinking not only about what is true, but also about what is good. Beyond just finding out what people know about a topic, questions of evaluation encourage you to find out what people believe about a certain topic. Now, in our facts-oriented world, it might be strange to say that an evaluative question is more rigorous than a factual question. But remember, our goal is to write a rhetorical argument. In such a context, facts, while important, are not in themselves the goal of writing. For example, you might have ants in your pantry, and that's a simple fact. You may even know what species of ants they are and how that species relates to other kinds of ants or insects. All of those things are facts, but none of those facts will tell you what to do about the problem of having ants in your pantry. So the first two types of questions that we've discussed today can tell you what is true, but they can't tell you what ought to be done based on what is true. Evaluation questions, however, get us closer to understanding what to do because they help us to figure out how the different facts relate to the beliefs and values of the people around us. So consider these questions of evaluation. Is Fahrenheit a bad temperature scale? Obviously, bad is an evaluative word, so you would have to do some research to figure out what bad means in a particular context in order to answer this question. Are capybaras harmful to agriculture? Now that's a question that puts facts up against cultural values and practices. In answering that question, you'll have to understand environmental and economic values and how they relate to each other. Was it right to make Arizona a state? Again, obviously, this question is no longer just about facts. You'll have to look into people's beliefs and values in order to answer this question. In any case, evaluative questions set you up to write more complex papers. The answers to these kinds of questions are not just simple facts that you can present in a word or a couple of short sentences. Instead, you'll have to spend time explaining how the facts work together within a system of values, and that's something that you could definitely take several pages doing. In fact, questions of evaluation offer such a leap forward when compared with the other types of questions we've discussed so far that many academic writing assignments will just stop there, only asking you to take a pro-con position on a particular issue. Of course, if you were to write an argument based on an evaluative set of questions, you could debate the topic and respond to other viewpoints, but that's also about all that you could do. In other words, a question of evaluation will only help you to make an argument about whether something is good or bad, but it won't help you or your readers to know what to do based on that knowledge. You could write a wonderful paper telling somebody that apples are the worst fruit, but so what? What do they do with that information after you share it with them? Really, stating your position on an issue is only of limited value. If you're going to write a paper that really makes a difference, you're going to have to start by asking a different kind of question. Finally, we arrive at the most powerful kind of research question, the action-oriented question. These types of questions do not just ask what is true, nor do they ask just what is good. They ask what should be done with the knowledge that you have. In other words, while they consider what is true and what is good, they then push you to consider how to put that knowledge to work. So, for example, if you asked a question like, should the United States abandon the Fahrenheit scale, you would be involved in a research process that would require you to consider the facts, to see how they relate to each other, and to understand the values and beliefs that are at play and to evaluate all of them in that context. But it wouldn't stop there. After doing all of that, your research question would then push you to tell your readers what to do with all of the knowledge that you've gained. So you can see we've come a long way from the kind of research and writing process that is generated by a simple question like, what's the boiling temperature of water? Where you could answer that question with a simple number and without a lot of controversy. Answering an action-oriented question will put you in a position to write a longer, more complex and compelling paper, and certainly one that people will probably have opinions about. Strong action-oriented questions will typically follow the format, what should we do about fill in the blank? Because such a question considers not only what is true and good, but also what to do about the thing that you're researching, asking questions in this format will set you up for a really productive research process. A good action-oriented question will help you to ask yourself, so what, as you proceed through the research process. Sure, you've done research and decided perhaps that capybaras are somehow in fact responsible for harm to agriculture, but so what? What do we do with that information? Should capybaras be hunted? Should farmers be relocated? Your research has revealed a problem, and now it can help you to devise a solution. As you think about what other people are saying about the problem and possible solutions, you can now work your way towards making a meaningful contribution to that ongoing debate. And this is where the real value of action-oriented research questions comes in. If you stop at evaluative questions, you'll only be able to share your opinion with your readers. And while your opinion is of course valuable, it's not going to accomplish much. When you work with an action-oriented question though, you're not just sharing your opinion, you're working instead on solving a problem. So if you only work with the first three kinds of questions we've discussed, The best case scenario is that you'll write a paper that leaves your reader saying, wow, that was pretty interesting. But if you work with an action-oriented question, you'll be able to write a paper that will leave your reader saying, wow, now I know what to do to make things better. The most powerful rhetorical writing is the kind that makes a real difference in the world, whether that's a large one or a small one. Announcing your opinion to millions of people might seem pretty flashy, but honestly, it's not as meaningful as helping 100 people to make a material difference in their conditions. The best papers offer specific solutions to real practical problems, and your ability to write that kind of a paper will depend in large part upon your ability to ask the right kinds of research questions. Like we said at the beginning, the kinds of questions that you ask will determine the kinds of papers that you can write. So if you're going to write a paper that makes a difference, you're going to have to ask research questions that have that goal in mind. In short, you're in the best position to write a strong paper that will make a difference if your research process starts out with an action-oriented question. Of course, that's not to say that the other kinds of questions are worthless. In order to answer your action-oriented question, you'll still have to answer many questions of the other three varieties. So it's not so much a matter of only asking action-oriented questions. Instead, it's more a matter of making sure that you don't limit your project's potential by stopping too soon as you develop your research questions. Because with the right set of questions, your project will have greater potential to do real good, and that's what this is all about. And with that, we'll take a break until next time. If our conversation was helpful, give us a like. Also, don't be shy about sharing your writing questions in the comments so that we can address them in a future video, and don't forget to make someone's day by sharing this video with a friend. Catch you on the flippity.